The ballroom sparkled like something out of a fairy tale. Massive chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm golden light across the polished marble floors. Women in elegant gowns moved gracefully between clusters of men in expensive suits. Waiters glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne and appetizers that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery bills. This was the annual charity gala at the Riverside Grand Hotel, the kind of event where the city's wealthiest gathered to write checks, make connections, and remind themselves they were doing good in the world. Tickets started at $500, and that was just to get through the door. Near the center of the grand ballroom stood a magnificent black piano. It sat on a raised platform, positioned perfectly under a spotlight waiting. The evening's entertainment was supposed to be a famous concert pianist from Europe, someone whose name appeared on albums and concert halls around the world. But there was a problem. His flight had been delayed. Technical issues, they said. He wouldn't arrive for at least another hour, maybe 2. The guests didn't seem too bothered. They continued their conversations, sipped their drinks, and enjoyed the atmosphere. But one man kept drifting back to look at the piano. His name was Robert. And if you asked anyone in that room who he was, they'd tell you he was someone important. A tech millionaire. Self-made. Started with nothing and built a company worth hundreds of millions. At 42 years old, he had everything money could buy, and the confidence that came with it. Robert stood near the piano with 4 other men from his social circle. They were discussing business, politics, and Robert's latest acquisition. A rare Steinway piano, custom-built, that he'd purchased at an auction for an amount that made even wealthy people's eyes widen. He didn't play much, if he was being honest. Maybe twice since he bought it. But it looked incredible in his penthouse, and that was worth something too. That's when Robert noticed the old man. He was standing a few feet away, looking at the piano with an expression that was hard to read. Not greedy or envious, just appreciative, like someone admiring a sunset. The man appeared to be in his late 60s, maybe older. His suit was clean and pressed, but it wasn't expensive. You could tell. The fabric was a bit thin, the cut slightly outdated. His shoes were polished but worn at the edges. His hands, resting at his sides, were weathered and marked with the kind of calluses that came from real work. Robert felt a familiar stirring in his chest. The same feeling he got when he spotted weakness in a business negotiation or saw an opportunity to assert himself. He couldn't help it. It was instinct at this point. He excused himself from his group and walked over to the old man with an easy smile, the kind of smile that looked friendly but had edges to it. "Beautiful instrument, isn't it?" Robert said, his voice carrying just enough volume that people nearby could hear. The old man turned, slightly startled, then smiled warmly. "Yes, it really is. I've always loved the sound of a properly maintained piano. Do you play?" Robert asked. He already knew the answer, or thought he did. This man clearly didn't belong at an event like this. Probably won some lottery ticket or received a charity invitation. Either way, he was out of his element. "A little bit," the man replied modestly. His voice was soft, kind even. Robert couldn't help himself. He laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly, but loud enough that heads turned. His friends noticed and started drifting over, curious about what was happening. "A little bit? Let me guess what that means."
"Chopsticks?"
"Maybe happy birthday," Robert said, and a few people chuckled. "I've been taking piano lessons myself for 2 years now. $300 an hour with the best instructor money can buy. It's harder than it looks, let me tell you." The old man just nodded, his expression unchanged. "That's wonderful that you're learning. It's never too late to start." But Robert was on a roll now. More people had gathered, forming a loose circle around them. Some looked uncomfortable, sensing where this was going. Others seemed entertained, curious to see what would happen next. A few had already pulled out their phones. "You know what's interesting about this piano?" Robert continued, gesturing toward the instrument. "It's a Steinway Model D concert grand, worth about $200,000. Takes months to build, every single one crafted by hand. The keys have to be weighted perfectly. The soundboard aged just right. It's not like the uprights you see in churches or school gymnasiums." The old man listened patiently, his hands folded in front of him. "I'm just curious," Robert went on, warming to his audience now. "When you say you play a little bit, what exactly does that mean? Can you read music? Do you know any classical pieces? Have you ever heard of Chopin?" "I know Chopin," the man said quietly. Robert's grin widened. "You know Chopin. That's fantastic. So you know his music is considered some of the most technically demanding piano repertoire ever written, right? Professional pianists spend years mastering even his simpler pieces. The crowd had grown larger now. Maybe 30 people formed a semicircle around Robert and the old man. The energy in the room had shifted. Conversations elsewhere had stopped. Everyone sensed something was happening. "Tell you what," Robert announced, his voice taking on a theatrical quality. "Since our scheduled performer is delayed and we're all just standing around, why don't you play something for us? You can play Chopin, can't you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The old man remained silent for a moment, his eyes moving from Robert to the piano, then to the crowd of expectant faces. Some people looked genuinely interested. Others appeared embarrassed on the old man's behalf. A few seemed eager to see him fail, to be entertained by the spectacle. Finally, the old man spoke. "I suppose I could play something if nobody would mind." Robert threw his hands up in mock excitement. "Mind, we'd be delighted. Please be our guest." He gestured toward the stage with an exaggerated bow, his voice dripping with sarcasm that everyone could hear. "Let's see what you've got. Honestly, I could use some entertainment before dinner. Maybe you'll surprise us all." His friends laughed. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. One woman, older and kinder looking than most, placed her hand over her mouth, looking genuinely concerned for the elderly man. But the old man's expression didn't change. He didn't look angry or embarrassed or nervous. He simply nodded, thanked Robert politely, and began walking toward the stage. His steps were slow, measured. There was a slight stiffness in his gait that spoke of age and perhaps old injuries. He climbed the 3 steps to the platform carefully, holding the railing. When he reached the piano bench, he stood beside it for a moment, looking down at the keys with an expression that might have been recognition, or memory, or both. Then he sat down. The room fell completely silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. Every eye was fixed on the old man as he adjusted the bench slightly, flexing his weathered fingers once, twice. He placed his hands gently on the keys, closed his eyes, and took one slow, deep breath. Robert stood with his arms crossed, his smirk still firmly in place, waiting for the disaster he was certain was about to unfold. Then the old man began to play. The first note floated through the ballroom like a whisper made of pure light. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was gentle, almost fragile. But there was something about it that made everyone freeze. The quality of the sound, maybe, or the way it seemed to hang in the air for just a moment longer than seemed possible. Robert's smirk faltered slightly, just for a second. Then it came back. One good note didn't mean anything. Even a broken clock was right twice a day. But then came the second note, and the third, and suddenly the old man's fingers were moving across the keys with a fluidity that didn't seem possible for someone his age. His weathered hands, which had looked so rough and ordinary just moments ago, now danced across the piano like they were born to be there. The piece was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Even people who didn't know classical music had probably heard it before. It's one of those melodies that feels familiar even the first time you hear it, like a memory from a dream you can't quite place. But this wasn't just someone playing the notes correctly. This was something else entirely. The old man swayed slightly as he played, his eyes still closed, his face peaceful. His hands moved with such natural grace that it looked effortless, like breathing. The melody rose and fell, whispered and sang, each phrase flowing into the next without any breaks or hesitation. It wasn't just technically perfect. It was beautiful in a way that made your chest feel tight. Robert's smile had completely vanished now. His arms were still crossed, but his posture had changed, stiffened, his jaw was clenched. Around him, the crowd had gone absolutely silent. Not the polite silence of people trying to be respectful. The stunned silence of people who suddenly realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. A woman in a blue dress had tears streaming down her cheeks. She wasn't crying exactly. Not sobbing, but the tears just kept coming as she listened. A man in his 50s stood completely motionless, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips, forgotten. 2 young women who had been scrolling on their phones moments earlier now held them limply at their sides. Completely absorbed in the music, the melody climbed higher, the notes cascading like water over stones, then dipped low into something that sounded almost like heartbreak. The old man's fingers found harmonies and textures in the piece that most people had probably never noticed before. He made the piano sing in ways that seemed impossible. Robert felt heat crawling up his neck. His friends, the ones who had been laughing with him just minutes ago, weren't looking at the old man anymore. They were glancing at Robert with expressions that ranged from discomfort to outright pity. One of them, a banker named Gregory, actually winced and looked away. The worst part was that Robert knew enough about piano now, after 2 years of expensive lessons, to understand exactly what he was witnessing. This wasn't just good. This was masterful. The old man's technique was flawless. His touch on the keys produced a tone that was rich and warm and somehow human in a way that transcended, just hitting the right notes at the right time. Every ornament, every trill, every delicate run up the keyboard was executed with perfect clarity and intention. The dynamic control, the way he could make a single note whisper or soar, the way he shaped each phrase like a sculptor working with sound instead of clay. This was decades of skill, maybe a lifetime. Robert's expensive instructor, the one who charged $300 an hour, was good, professional, competent. But watching this old man play, Robert suddenly understood the difference between someone who taught piano and someone who lived it. The music swelled to a gentle climax, the melody singing out clear and pure, then began to descend again into quieter territory. The old man's hands moved to the lower register of the piano, drawing out deep, resonant tones that seemed to vibrate in people's chests. More people had tears in their eyes now. An elderly couple stood holding hands, swaying slightly to the music. A waiter who should have been working had set down his tray and stood transfixed near the wall. Even the hotel manager, a stern woman who rarely showed emotion, had stopped by the entrance to the ballroom with her hand over her heart. Robert felt something cold settling in his stomach. Shame, maybe, or the realization of what he'd done. He'd tried to humiliate this man in front of all these people. He'd mocked him, belittled him, used him as entertainment. And now everyone in this room would remember this moment, but they wouldn't remember it the way Robert had planned. They wouldn't remember some old fool embarrassing himself at the piano. They would remember the arrogant tech millionaire who had been so sure of himself, so convinced of his superiority, that he'd challenged a complete stranger to play without having any idea who he was dealing with. Some people in the crowd had started recording on their phones. Robert noticed them out of the corner of his eye. Great, just perfect. By tomorrow morning, this would probably be all over social media. Millionaire gets humbled at charity gala. Rich guy challenges elderly man to play piano. Instantly regrets it. He could already see the headlines. The old man's playing had become softer now, more intimate. The melody floated through its final phrases like a lullaby, each note placed with such care and tenderness that it felt almost sacred. His hands slowed, the music breathing its last few measures, and then came to rest. The final note hung in the air, sustained by the piano's natural resonance, gradually fading into silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For 3 or 4 seconds, the ballroom remained completely frozen, as if everyone was afraid that making a sound would somehow break the spell. Then someone started clapping, just one person at first, but within a heartbeat the entire room erupted. The applause was thunderous, overwhelming. People weren't just clapping politely. They were cheering. Several people shot to their feet, and within seconds everyone was standing, applauding like they'd just witnessed something they'd remember for the rest of their lives, because they had. The old man opened his eyes slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep. He looked out at the crowd with that same gentle expression he'd worn throughout, seemingly surprised by the reaction. He stood carefully, his movements slow and deliberate, and gave a small, humble bow. The applause continued. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" Others joined in. The woman in the blue dress was openly crying now, still clapping. The elderly couple was beaming. Even the waiters were applauding. Robert stood frozen among the standing crowd, his hands coming together in mechanical claps that he didn't even feel. His face was burning. His throat felt tight. All around him, people were looking his way with expressions that ranged from disappointment to disgust. The old man descended the steps from the stage carefully, holding the railing again. People immediately rushed toward him, wanting to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him how moved they were. He accepted their praise with quiet grace, nodding and smiling, thanking them in return. Then an elderly woman in an elegant silver dress pushed through the crowd. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with recognition. "Wait," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Wait, everyone. Do you know who this is?" The crowd quieted slightly, turning to look at her. She was staring at the old man with an expression of complete shock. "This is David Morrison. I saw him perform 30 years ago in New York." "My God, everyone, do you understand who just played for us?" The name rippled through the crowd. People pulled out their phones, searching. Within seconds, faces began to change. Eyes widened. Mouths dropped open. Robert pulled out his own phone with trembling fingers and typed the name. What he saw made his stomach drop. Robert stared at his phone screen, his hands shaking slightly. There were dozens of results. Concert programs from prestigious halls around the world. Old newspaper reviews. Video recordings from performances decades ago. Professional photographs of a younger version of the old man, dressed in formal concert attire, seated at grand pianos on stages that held thousands of people. David Morrison, principal pianist for the National Symphony Orchestra for 23 years, guest performer with the London Philharmonic, the Berlin Philharmonic, the Tokyo Symphony, recordings that won awards, performances at Carnegie Hall, the Kennedy Center, the Royal Albert Hall in London, a career that spanned 4 decades at the absolute highest level of classical music, one of the finest interpreters of Chopin of his entire generation. Robert felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath him. All the blood drained from his face. His expensive suit suddenly felt like it was made of sandpaper. His tie was too tight. The room was too hot. Too many people were looking at him. Around him, the crowd was buzzing with excitement and disbelief. People were showing each other their phones, sharing what they'd found. The energy in the room had completely transformed from polite charity gala to something electric, almost frantic. "I saw him perform in Chicago in 1994. One man was saying, his voice filled with awe. "He played Rachmaninoff. I've never forgotten it. That was 30 years ago, and I still remember every moment." "There's a recording of him playing Beethoven's Emperor Concerto," a woman said, scrolling frantically through her phone. "It has over 2 million views. How did we not recognize him? He looks so different now," someone else replied. "Older, obviously. And the way he was dressed, nobody expected." That last comment hung in the air uncomfortably. Nobody expected someone dressed like that, looking like that, to be someone of such extraordinary caliber. They'd all made the same assumptions Robert had made. They'd looked at his worn suit and his weathered hands and decided they knew exactly who he was. They'd been wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. The elderly woman who'd recognized him first was now standing next to David, holding his hand in both of hers, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Morrison, I don't know if you remember, but I came to your master class at Juilliard in 1992. You changed my entire understanding of music. My daughter became a pianist because of you." David smiled warmly at her, patting her hands gently. "That's very kind of you to say. I'm so glad music has been part of your family's life." More people pressed forward with their own stories. A middle-aged man explained that he'd listened to David's recording of Chopin's ballads every night while studying for his medical boards. A younger woman said her piano teacher had always held up David Morrison as the standard, the example of what musical excellence looked like. Through it all, David remained humble and gracious, thanking everyone, asking them about their own lives and their own connections to music. He seemed genuinely more interested in their stories than in talking about himself. Someone finally asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Mr. Morrison," a journalist from the local arts section said, her voice cutting through the chatter, "I hope this isn't too personal, but what happened? You were at the peak of your career and then you just disappeared. There were rumors, but nobody really knew. Why did you stop performing?" The room quieted again. Everyone wanted to hear the answer. David took a slow breath, his expression becoming more serious but not sad. "My wife got sick," he said simply. "Cancer, about 15 years ago now. The treatment was aggressive and it was expensive. Even with insurance, the medical bills were substantial." He paused, looking down at his weathered hands. "But more than the money, she needed me there. Concert life means constant travel. You're in a different city every week, sometimes a different country. I was spending more time in hotels and airports than I was spending at home. When she got her diagnosis, the choice was clear. I retired." "You gave up everything," the woman in the silver dress said softly. Your career, your reputation, everything you'd built. David looked up at her with a gentle smile. I didn't give up anything. I chose what mattered most. My wife needed me, and I got to spend her final years with her. We had time together. Real time. Not phone calls from hotel rooms or rushed visits between performances. That wasn't a sacrifice. That was a gift. Several people in the crowd were crying now. Even some of the men had misty eyes. After she passed 5 years ago, David continued, I thought about going back to performing. Some people reached out, offered opportunities, but I'd found something else by then. I'd taken a job at the community center across town, maintaining the building, helping with programs. I started teaching piano to kids there, free lessons for families who couldn't afford them. He chuckled softly. Most of them have never heard of Carnegie Hall. They don't know about my recordings or my career. To them, I'm just Mr. Morrison, the guy who fixes the broken stage lights and teaches them how to play Ode to Joy. And honestly, that's been more fulfilling than I ever expected, the journalist pressed on gently. But don't you miss it? The performances, the recognition, She gestured around the elegant ballroom. All of this? David considered the question carefully. Sometimes, he admitted, I miss the feeling of a concert hall right before you walk on stage. That particular kind of silence full of anticipation. I miss the connection you feel with an orchestra when everything clicks perfectly. But you know what I don't miss? The pressure, the constant judgment, the need to prove yourself over and over, the way people measure your worth by your last performance or your ticket sales. He looked around at the crowd, his gaze warm but penetrating. I spent 40 years at the top of my profession. I met presidents and royalty. I played in the most beautiful concert halls ever built. And all of that was wonderful. But the most meaningful thing I've done in the last 5 years? Teaching a 10-year-old girl from a struggling family how to play her first scale. Watching her face light up when she finally got it right. That matters just as much, maybe more. The room was completely silent now. People weren't just listening. They were absorbing, reconsidering. Some looked inspired. Others looked uncomfortable, maybe recognizing something about their own priorities reflected back at them. Then someone asked, their voice tentative, So how did you end up here tonight? David laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Pure luck, actually. The community center bought lottery tickets for this event. It's a fundraiser, and they thought it would be nice if some of us could attend. My name was drawn. I almost didn't come. This isn't really my world anymore. He gestured at his suit with a self-deprecating smile, as you can probably tell from my fashion choices. That got some warm laughter from the crowd, breaking the tension slightly. But then David's expression became more serious. He turned and looked directly at Robert. The crowd noticed. Heads swiveled. The energy shifted again, becoming tense. Everyone remembered what had happened before the performance. Everyone remembered Robert's mocking tone, his cruel challenge, his assumption that this old man couldn't possibly know anything about real piano playing. Robert wanted to disappear, to run, to be literally anywhere else in the world. But he was trapped, frozen in place by dozens of watching eyes. David began walking toward him. The crowd parted silently, creating a path between the two men. You could have heard a pin drop. Robert's heart was hammering so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. David stopped directly in front of him. Robert couldn't meet his eyes. He stared at the floor, his face burning with shame so intense it felt physical. Then David did something nobody expected. He extended his hand. Robert stared at the extended hand like it was something he couldn't quite understand. His brain couldn't process it. This man, this legend whom he had humiliated in front of all these people, was offering to shake his hand. Slowly, mechanically, Robert raised his own hand and took it. David's grip was firm but not aggressive. Warm, the handshake of someone who meant it. Mr. Chen, David said quietly, his voice low enough that only Robert and the people immediately around them could hear. Thank you for the invitation to play tonight. I appreciate your passion for the piano. Robert's throat closed up completely. He couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The kindness in David's voice was somehow worse than anger would have been, worse than contempt. It made the shame cut deeper. 2 years of lessons, David continued, still holding Robert's hand, his eyes steady and kind. That's a real commitment. Learning an instrument as an adult is difficult. It requires courage to start something new, especially something as humbling as music. You should be proud of that. The words were genuine. There was no sarcasm, no hidden barb. David actually meant it. That somehow made everything worse. Robert finally found his voice, though it came out rough and barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know who you were. I shouldn't have. I was completely out of line. David released his hand and placed a gentle hand on Robert's shoulder instead. You didn't know. That's true. But would it have been different if you did know? The question hung in the air between them. Robert opened his mouth, then closed it. Because the honest answer was yes, of course it would have been different. If he'd known he was talking to a famous concert pianist, he never would have challenged him. He would have been respectful, maybe even fawning, but that wasn't the point David was making. I think, David said softly, that's something worth thinking about. Whether we treat people with respect because of who they are, or simply because they're people. Robert felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He was 42 years old, a millionaire, a successful businessman, and he was about to cry in front of 100 people at a charity gala. He blinked hard, trying to force the tears back. David seemed to sense his struggle. He leaned in slightly, speaking even more quietly. You have resources that many people would dream of. Your Steinway piano, your expensive lessons, this life you've built. Those are gifts. Real gifts, but music isn't about what we own or what we spend. He paused, making sure Robert was really listening. It's about what we give. It's about connection, about vulnerability, about being willing to serve something larger than ourselves. When you sit down at your piano at home, ask yourself, am I playing to impress people? To prove something? Or am I playing because the music itself matters? Robert nodded, not trusting himself to speak. You asked me earlier if I could play Chopin, David continued, and there was the faintest hint of a smile in his eyes now. But the real question isn't whether someone can play the notes. The real question is, when you play, do you play for others or only for yourself? Do you play to show off what you know or to share something beautiful? The words hit Robert like a physical blow, because he knew the answer. Every time he'd played his expensive piano, every time he'd mentioned his $300 an hour lessons, it had been about his ego. About proving he could afford it, that he was cultured, that he was more than just a tech guy with money. The music itself had been secondary. I've been doing it all wrong, Robert said, his voice cracking slightly. David squeezed his shoulder. You've been learning. That's different. We all start somewhere. The important thing is where we go from here. Around them, people were watching with rapt attention. Some were nodding along with David's words. Others looked thoughtful, perhaps recognizing their own behaviors in what was being said. The journalist had her phone out, recording, but for once Robert didn't care. I want to do better, Robert said, and he meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. I want to learn. Not just piano, but what you're talking about. The rest of it, David smiled then, a full, genuine smile. Good, that's a good start. Real musicianship isn't just about technique. It's about empathy, about listening, about understanding that every person you meet has a story you don't know, talents you haven't seen, depths you can't imagine from the outside. He gestured around the ballroom. Everyone here tonight, from the people in designer dresses to the waiters serving drinks, they all have something valuable to offer. Something to teach us if we're humble enough to listen. That's what music taught me. Every piece of music is like a conversation with the composer, with history, with other musicians. You have to listen more than you speak. Robert nodded, absorbing every word. His friends standing nearby looked distinctly uncomfortable. A few had slipped away when the confrontation started, but Gregory, the banker, stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, Gregory said, his voice respectful. What you've said tonight, it's not just about music, is it? David turned to him with interest. No, it's not. Music is just one way of learning these lessons. But the principles apply to everything. Business, relationships, life. Are we trying to dominate or are we trying to connect? Are we performing for applause or are we genuinely trying to contribute something meaningful? Another person in the crowd spoke up, a younger woman who looked like she might be in her 30s. But isn't there a balance? I mean, you were successful. You performed at the highest level. You must have been competitive, driven. You must have cared about recognition. David nodded thoughtfully. Absolutely. I was driven. I practiced 8 hours a day for years. I wanted to be the best, but somewhere along the way the goal shifted. It stopped being about proving I was better than other pianists. It became about serving the music itself, about bringing something beautiful into the world. That's when the real growth happened. He looked back at Robert. Ambition isn't bad. Success isn't bad. Money isn't bad. But when those things become the only measure of worth, when we start judging people solely by their status or wealth or accomplishments, we miss so much. We miss the full humanity of the people around us. The ballroom had become something like a masterclass, with David at the center. People were hanging on every word. The scheduled performer had actually arrived during all of this, the famous pianist from Europe. But he was standing at the back of the crowd, listening intently, making no move to interrupt. I spent 40 years chasing perfection in music, David said to the crowd at large now. And you know what I learned? Perfection isn't the goal. Connection is. I've heard technically flawless performances that left me cold, and I've heard students make mistakes but play with such heart that everyone in the room was moved to tears. The difference isn't in the notes. It's in the intention behind them. He turned back to Robert one more time. Your 2 years of lessons? That's your beginning. Keep going. But practice with purpose. Don't just learn pieces to show people you can play them. Learn them because they're beautiful, because they have something to say. And when you do perform, even if it's just for yourself, play with honesty, play with vulnerability. That's where the real music lives. Robert felt something shift inside his chest, a tightness releasing. He took a deep breath. Would you consider teaching me? I know that's a lot to ask after everything, but I want to learn, really learn, not just piano, but what you're talking about. The crowd murmured with interest. Everyone waited for David's response. David studied Robert's face for a long moment as if weighing something. Then he smiled. Tell you what, come by the community center. Tuesday and Thursday evenings I teach lessons from 6 to 8. It's not fancy. The piano is an old upright. Nothing like that Steinway on stage. But if you're serious about learning, really learning, I'll be there. I'll be there, Robert said immediately. This Tuesday. I promise. Good, David said. He gave Robert's shoulder one final pat, then stepped back. The crowd erupted into applause again, though this time it was different. Warmer somehow, more hopeful. The famous European pianist, the one everyone had originally come to hear, finally made his way through the crowd. He was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and an elegant manner. Instead of being annoyed at having his spotlight stolen, he looked genuinely moved. Mr. Morrison, he said, extending his hand. I'm honored to share this evening with you. Your recording of the Chopin ballads was one of the reasons I became a professional pianist. Would you consider playing one more piece? Perhaps we could play something together? David looked surprised, then pleased. That's very generous of you, but this is your evening. People came to hear you. I think, the European pianist said, glancing at the eager faces around them. People got something even better than they expected tonight, but if you're willing, I would be deeply honored. David agreed, and the two men made their way back to the piano together. What followed was an impromptu performance that nobody who attended that gala would ever forget. They played a duet arrangement of a piece by Schubert, their four hands moving across the keys in perfect synchronization, years of experience and mutual respect evident in every note. The crowd was mesmerized all over again. But this time, the feeling in the room was different. Less about shock and more about pure joy. The kind of joy that comes from witnessing something beautiful and real. When they finished, the applause was deafening. People stood and cheered. The two pianists bowed together, then embraced like old colleagues, even though they'd just met. As the formal entertainment portion of the evening continued, Robert found himself unable to focus on anything else. He kept replaying the entire encounter in his mind. The mockery, the performance, David's incredible grace in the face of humiliation. The lessons that had been offered so freely. He'd been given a gift tonight, though not the kind he was used to receiving. Not money or status or connections, something more valuable and far more uncomfortable. He'd been given a mirror that showed him exactly who he'd become, and it wasn't pretty. His phone buzzed constantly throughout the rest of the evening. The videos were already spreading. Multiple people had recorded the performance and the conversation that followed. The story was gaining traction on social media. Millionaire humbled by elderly pianist. Concert legend teaches billionaire about true wealth. The most beautiful takedown you'll ever see. Robert read through some of the comments. Most were critical of him as he deserved, but some were more thoughtful. People sharing their own stories about times they'd judged others unfairly. Discussions about success and what really matters in life. A few even defended him, noting that he'd been humble enough to apologize and ask to learn. That last group gave him a small spark of hope. Maybe this didn't have to define him. Maybe this could be the start of something different. The next morning, Robert woke up early. He didn't go into his office, which was unusual for a Sunday. Instead, he sat at his expensive Steinway piano in his penthouse. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. He placed his hands on the keys and tried to play a simple piece he'd been learning. But for the first time, he really listened to what he was playing, not thinking about whether he was getting the notes right or how impressive he might sound. Just listening to the music itself. It sounded empty, mechanical. He was hitting all the right notes, following all the dynamics his instructor had marked in the sheet music. But there was nothing of himself in it. Nothing real. He stopped playing and sat there for a long time, just thinking. On Monday, Robert did something he'd never done before. He called his assistant and told her to clear his schedule for the afternoon. Then he drove across town to the community center where David worked. It was in a neighborhood Robert rarely visited. The buildings were older, some showing signs of neglect. The community center itself was a converted school building, probably 70 or 80 years old. The parking lot had cracks in the asphalt and faded painted lines. Inside, the place was buzzing with activity. Kids playing basketball in the gym, an art class in one room, an ESL class for immigrants in another. The walls were decorated with children's artwork and community announcements written in multiple languages. Robert found David in a small office looking over some maintenance reports. He was wearing work clothes now, jeans and a simple button-down shirt. He looked up when Robert knocked on the open door and his face broke into a warm smile. "Mr. Chen, I didn't expect to see you until Tuesday." "I know," Robert said, feeling suddenly awkward. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to talk to you, if you have time." David gestured to a chair. "Of course, please sit." They talked for over an hour. Robert found himself opening up in ways he rarely did. He talked about his journey building his company, the sacrifices he'd made, the relationships he'd lost along the way success had changed him, hardened him, made him measure everything and everyone by metrics that now seemed hollow. David listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, mostly just being present. "I've been thinking about what you said," Robert finally told him, "about playing for others versus playing for yourself. And I realized I've been living my whole life trying to prove something, to show everyone who doubted me that I could make it, that I could be somebody." "And did you prove it?" David asked gently. "Yeah, I did. I've got the money, the success, the recognition, everything I thought I wanted." Robert paused, his voice dropping. "But Saturday night, when I saw what you gave up, the life you chose after your wife got sick, the way you teach these kids for free, the peace you seem to have, I realized I haven't built anything that matters." "Not really. I've just been collecting trophies." David was quiet for a moment. "You know, success isn't the problem. Neither is wealth. The problem is when we start believing that those things define our worth, when we start treating people as if their value depends on what they have or what they've accomplished." "I've been doing that," Robert admitted, "for years. And I didn't even realize it until Saturday." "Well," David said with a slight smile, "now you do realize it. So what are you going to do about it?" That question had been haunting Robert all weekend. He'd thought about it from every angle, and he'd come to a decision. "I want to start a scholarship fund," he said, "for young musicians from families who can't afford lessons or instruments. Real funding, not just a token gesture. Enough to actually change lives." David's eyes lit up. "That's a beautiful idea." "And I want you to help me run it," Robert continued. "I'll provide the money, but I need someone who actually understands music, who knows these communities, who can identify the kids who have talent but no opportunity. Would you consider it?" David leaned back in his chair, studying Robert carefully. "You're serious about this?" "Completely serious. I know I can't undo Saturday night. I can't take back the person I've been, but maybe I can do something meaningful going forward." They talked for another hour about logistics and possibilities. David introduced him to some of the young people at the center. Robert met a 15-year-old girl who'd been teaching herself piano on a keyboard with broken keys. A 12-year-old boy who could hear a melody once and play it back perfectly, but had never had a formal lesson. Kids with raw talent and passion but no resources. By the time Robert left, they'd outlined a plan. The scholarship fund would launch within 3 months. They'd start small, maybe 10 students the first year, but build from there. David would identify candidates and provide guidance. Robert would handle the funding and logistics, but more than that, Robert would show up. Really show up. Not just write checks from a distance, but actually meet these kids, understand their stories, be part of their journey. Tuesday evening, Robert drove back across town to the community center. He arrived at 5:45, 15 minutes early. He didn't wear a suit this time. Just jeans and a casual shirt. He brought a notebook and a recording device to capture the lessons. The piano room was small and a bit cramped. The upright piano David had mentioned was indeed nothing special. The bench wobbled slightly. But when David began to teach, none of that mattered. For the first time in his expensive piano education, Robert learned what it meant to really listen. To feel the music instead of just executing it. To understand that every note was a choice, a chance to communicate something. He made mistakes. Lots of them. His fingers stumbled over passages. He lost his place. But David never showed frustration, only patience and encouragement. At one point, David stopped him mid-piece. "You're thinking too much. Stop trying to play it perfectly. Just tell me a story. Pretend you're sharing something important with someone you love. What would you want them to feel?" Robert tried again, and something shifted. The music was still imperfect, still full of errors. But there was something in it now. Something honest. After the lesson, as Robert was packing up his things, David said, "You did good work tonight. Keep practicing, but remember, the goal isn't perfection. It's connection." The story of what happened at the charity gala continued to spread. The videos racked up millions of views. News outlets picked it up. Think pieces were written about wealth and humility and what we value in society. But for Robert, the real story was quieter. It was showing up every Tuesday and Thursday. It was slowly, painfully learning to see people instead of just their surface. It was the scholarship fund that launched 3 months later, starting with 12 students who might never have had a chance otherwise. It was the first time one of those students performed at a recital, a nervous 10-year-old girl who'd never owned a real piano before. She made mistakes, lost her place twice, but played with such pure joy that half the audience was crying by the end. Robert, sitting in the front row, found tears streaming down his own face. That night, walking to his car, he thought about David's question from their first real conversation. "Do you play for others or for yourself?" He was starting to understand that it wasn't either or. Real music, real life was about both. It was about developing your skills and talents, yes, but then using them to contribute something meaningful, to connect, to lift others up instead of standing on top of them. His phone buzzed with another business notification, another deal closing, more money earned. It still mattered. But it didn't matter more than everything else anymore. Robert smiled to himself in the darkness. He still had a long way to go. He was still learning, still making mistakes, but for the first time in years he felt like he was playing the right song,